Now, so the specific terms of the exclusion clause, and this is clause 1, Article 1D, if anyone is interested, say that they don't actually name Palestinians, right? It doesn't say Palestinians are excluded. It says people are excluded who are already receiving assistance from another UN agency. So that was UNRWA. It was only Palestinians, right? So this was a Palestinian exclusion clause, but it's written as a generic thing. Now the UNHCR has issued a number of opinions over the years about the question of when and under what circumstances Palestinians might come under UNHCR protection. Because it is possible. But the basic point that they have come to is that Palestinians who live outside the area of UNRWA operations, right, so beyond the Middle East, could be eligible for UNHCR protections. Because if you're outside of UNRWA's area of operations, you're no longer receiving assistance from another UN agency, right? Now the Nezahin, to get back to your original point, don't receive services to the same degree in the same way as people who are registered as Lejein, but they do get some. So they don't come under UNHCR protection, but not full UNRWA. So they're a bit in a gap, right? So they can get in Gaza camp, I would in the health clinic sometimes people would come in and they could get their primary health care, even if they were Nezahin, not Lejein, but couldn't get the referral. UNRWA in Jordan refers people onto hospitals. So they weren't eligible for that. They were eligible for some things and not other things. And there are all sorts of, this is just one example of the ways in which the broad category of the Palestinian community, of Palestinian refugee community, is divided up bureaucratically with access to different things. All right. Make sense? Not logical sense, but
it's the way it is.
It's the way it is. Okay, so then back to Jordan, right? As I was saying before, in contrast to places like the West Bank and Lebanon, the humanitarian landscape is not nearly as dense there, right? There aren't anywhere near as many organizations working. Like everywhere, UNRWA is the major actor, but there are other smaller scale organizations working in the camp. MAP, which is a medical aid for Palestinians, has a clinic. There's an EU-funded community development office, which is under the auspices of UNRWA, but it's distinct from, it's kind of semi-independent. There are, of course, local zakat committees. There's the Islamic Center, which is a Jordan-wide Muslim Brotherhood supported charity. So there are organizations in the camp, but again, it's not dense institutionally, right? So you wouldn't have quite the same problem you might have here of being like, there are 20 NGOs, where are we going to fit, right? So to look at what people do with humanitarianism, I want to consider both how humanitarian discourse and categories structure claim making, and how the humanitarian condition unfolds over time, affecting people throughout their lives and across generations. So I want to start with the idea of humanitarian rights and the ways that people would use the language of humanitarianism to make some rights claims, right? Because ex-Gazans have, tremendous legal, social, and economic vulnerability. So their capacity to make claims of the government is limited, right? More so than Jordanian citizens, whose opportunities for political expression are also limited, right? It's not that Jordan is a free landscape of politics for other people, but it's even more limited for Gazans who are vulnerable to having their papers taken away. But they do make claims, right, despite this, of the government and of UNRWA. And the language and structure of humanitarianism are crucial in how they do so. I think the language of humanitarianism can provide a safer framework for making demands, even if those demands are for civil rights, right? So even if you're asking for something of the Jordanian government, couching it as a humanitarian matter can make it safer to do so. And of course, claiming rights is only one way of making political demands. There's all sorts of other ways, I think, of doing politics and making demands for yourself, but it's a very important mechanism. Now, despite their clear formal exclusion from citizenship in Gaza, I think that ex-Gazans sometimes sort of enact, right, inhabit the role of citizens to claim some of these rights. And I think that they work along the lines of what a French philosopher named Jacques Rancière describes as claiming rights that they had not. Now, he's got a kind of complicated formulation, but they call attention to ways in which they are, in practice, denied rights that they see as granted to them. Right? Rights to assistance based in international obligation to this community. So there's two things that go on. One saying, we haven't been given a set of rights, and we should be given them. Right? And then there's the claim, we have been given a set of rights, but they're not being put in practice. Right? So there's two sets of claims. One trying to expand the formal rights that you're given, and one trying to get in practice rights that are supposed to be yours. And so Rancière argues that it's precisely in the making of rights claims, not just having or not having rights, but actually going out there and making these demands for yourself, that politics lies. Right? He sees this as politics. Through claim making, he suggests, people can produce what he calls dissensus. So that's a dissensus is a dispute, a calling into question of the given order of things, right? So by saying I should have something that I don't have, you destabilize the situation, right? People might say, well, ex-Gazans are not Jordanians. They're here temporarily. They will go home, so we don't have to grant them, rights to property. And so they say, we will go home. We want to go home, but we're here now. You need to give us this, right? So that's disrupting. The effort is to disrupt the way that things are sort of laid out. Right? And so for Rancière, this act, like doing this, is what is politics, at the heart of politics. Right? And I think that there's lots of evidence that refugees in the Gaza camp do stage these scenes of dissensus, do try to create this disruption. One example, I attended a meeting in 2008 at the camp's community development office, which I said is sort of under the auspices of UNRWA, but funded by the EU, which was organized by UNRWA staff between the camp committee and the representative in parliament for the Jerash district. Right now, as non-citizens, camp residents don't have the right to vote in Jordanian elections, right? So technically, this is not their representative in a formal matter, but it proceeded very much like a constituent services meeting. Both parties sort of enacting that role, the representative suggesting that he had a responsibility to them, and them making claims. Right? And so the participants in the meeting identified what they saw as the most crucial issues that were facing ex-Gazans in Jordan, and the parliament member assured them of his desire to be of assistance. And the concerns that I heard at this meeting really echo what I hear from people throughout my research in the camp. And the language of claim making in this context highlights the ways that the humanitarian pair of obligation and compassion, right, these two aspects of humanitarian claims, and the tension between them shapes political life in the humanitarian space. Right? You see kind of a going back and forth of relying on claims of obligation and claims of compassion. Right, so the parliament member sort of prefaced the whole thing by saying that King Abdullah saw the right of return as the most important political issue for these refugees, but that he was also concerned with the improvement of living conditions. Right, so this is both a pairing of the question of rights and compassionate concern for the population, right, at the beginning, but it's also a setting of the limits. Right? This mention of the right of return isn't just a statement of commitment to Palestinian rights, but it's a statement of the limits of this population's opportunities in Jordan. And most of what the Jordanian government provides for people in the camp is through the mechanism of royal charity, right? So through makruma, right? So some people can get health care through this, or can get access to university education, but it's not systematic, right? And it's not stable, absolutely not, and it ebbs and flows. All right. Now, the reference to the right of return, of course, is a mention or a gesture to the importance of the question of taltin in relation to this population. And in Jordan, the role of taltin is kind of complicated because, of course, most Palestinians in Jordan are citizens of Jordan. So to a certain extent, they are settled there. Even as people have continued rights claims to return, they are certainly settled in the country, and many feel Jordanian as well as Palestinian. But for the ex-Gazans who don't have Jordanian citizenship, Taltin comes centrally. And in this way, I think it's very similar to the role that Taltin plays in political discourse in Lebanon, right? Where it's often very cynically mobilized, right? There's lots of reasons that Lebanese don't have an interest in changing the situation of Palestinians in the country, and it's only very partially, or maybe not at all, based on a commitment to Palestinian claims to return. But the language of Taltin is very important. So this comes up. It's not quite as fraught for the ex-Gazans in Jordan as it is for Palestinians in Lebanon, but it is a bit. Now, I would say that, of course, camp residents do not challenge the right of return. They claim the right of return, and they don't couch their demands as demands for political rights. Right? As one Mukhtar said in the meeting, Gazans need a solution from the human perspective. Right? They should be granted civil rights as refugees. So over and over again, people were saying that they needed full civil rights and a national number, but not citizenship. Right? So they're making a claim, a humanitarian claim for civil rights. Right? As Abu Hassan, who's school principal, said, living without a national number is living on the margins. And then he went on in the meeting to describe some of the consequences of that marginality. Because Gazans generally have not been allowed to own property, though there have been certain moments, some people do own property because it opened up for a year and they were able to buy, right? But mostly they can't. So they often enter into agreements with Jordanians to buy land on their behalf. So it's registered in the name of a Jordanian. And as Abu Hassan said at the meeting, just the day before, a man who held the title to the property of about 100 people in the camp had died. So what will happen, he asked? The man's heirs might, out of compassion, recognize the claims of these ex-Gazans, but they were under no legal obligation to do so. Now that doesn't mean they're not under a social obligation, but it highlights again the vulnerability of people trying to make their way in a system, but that leaves you without a whole set of protections. Right? Now, in this meeting, people were very sharp in their claim making. Right? So despite their vulnerability, they were willing to press their claims, very much acting like aggrieved citizens, but insisting, as I said, that these were not political rights, but civil rights or humanitarian rights, so making a distinction. And I think that the disavowal of politics is, in fact, a useful political strategy in a context not only of vulnerability, but a very, very heavy surveillance, right? So the intelligence services, mukhabarat, is watching everything that people are doing. So even as politics was disavowed, the claims made in this meeting, I think, are a clear instance of ex-Gazans acting like citizens to claim civic citizenship rights which they are denied. And to a great extent, it is the humanitarian frame that makes this possible. Right, as I said at the beginning, a lot of research has shown the kinds of ways that humanitarianism sometimes limits people's actions, but it can also provide a discursive framework, right, a language, and an institutional structure within which and from which people can make claims that go beyond the humanitarian realm.